Mrs. Lonnie Guinier, born in April 1950, so she's 68 years old now, is an American civil rights theorist. She's the Bennett Bosky Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and the first woman of color appointed to a tenured professorship there. Her work includes professional responsibilities of public lawyers, the relationship between democracy and the law, the role of race and gender in the political process, college admissions, and affirmative action. Her father is a black Panamanian-born and Jamaican and Harlem-raised scholar, while her mother is the daughter is a Jewish American, Eugenia Jeannie or Jeannie Paprin. Since the age of 12, according to Mrs. Guinier's own words, she has wanted or had wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Radcliffe College in 1971 and her a Doctor of Jurisprudence degree from Yale Law School in 1974. She then clerked for Judge Damon Keith of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, proceeding to serve as Special Assistant to Assistant Attorney General Drew Days in the Civil Rights Division during the Carter administration. In 1981, she was admitted to the District of Columbia Bar, and after Ronald Reagan took office, she joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People Legal Defense and Educational Fund as an assistant counsel, eventually becoming head of its voting rights project. And probably in this position, she then wrote some or several articles to serious law journals where she criticized what she called the narrow-minded notions of one vote, one voter rule, and suggested that the United States consider changing its electoral system so that its ethnic and racial minorities and women would be more fairly represented in its various legislatures, right from the city and town councils all the way to the United States Congress. So this, she proposed, could be done, for example, by adopting proportional representation, where at least several political parties' shares of the total vote roughly match their shares of the seats, or then creating multi-member electoral districts in those parts of the United States that have heavy concentrations of ethnic and racial minorities, and possibly women. And President Clinton, who had known her for quite many years and who had even participated in her wedding, decided to nominate her as Assistant Attorney General in April 1993. Republicans especially the conservative and highly partisan Republicans, were looking for a way to further embarrass Clinton, who had already had to withdraw two cabinet nominees, famously for and controversially for Attorney General. And they were looking for ways in which they could persuade enough senators, at least most of them Republicans, to filibuster the nomination. In other words, to keep debating it in the hopes that Clinton would eventually give up and withdraw her nomination and instead appoint someone else. They succeeded in fighting these serious law journals articles where she advocated electoral reform. However, she did not demand it. They started to call her the quota queen, although when critically and non-partisanly examined, her writers did not advocate any quotas. They advocated electoral reform. Finally, by late April 1993, her situation had become so difficult that, if I remember correctly from my reading of President Clinton's unflattering biography by the British journalist Martin Walker, Clinton, the President They Deserve, Senator Joseph Biden, or then some other Democratic senator who was also, probably Senator Joseph Biden, asked President Clinton to then wholeheartedly support Mrs. Guinier if he wanted his wholehearted support. This was a gentlemanly way of suggesting to Bill Clinton that probably it would be in the interests of his administration's filling of that position wiser to appoint someone else. Finally, on June the 2nd, 1993, Clinton had a tense and long meeting with Mrs. Guinier, and he explained to her that having acquainted himself with and thought about her law journal articles, he could not honestly agree with her on the subject of electoral reform. That while he agreed that the US electoral system, first past the post or single member plurality, discriminated against various groups such as the African Americans and women, electoral reform of the kind that she had advocated would not be the right way to correct imbalance. He then later called a press conference. Well, they probably have not been friends since then, or at least were not for a long time, in which he said something like this: "At the time of the nomination, I hadn't read Miss Guinier's writings. I wish I had. The trouble is that the battle to nominate her will be waged based on her writings. And I cannot fight a battle that I know is an uphill battle, that I know is distracting for the country, if I don't believe in the ground of the battle. That's the whole point." He also said, "This has nothing to do with a political center. This has to do with my center." Because Clinton had frequently been accused of having almost no political positions that he would defend to the last, of always wanting to compromise when it was politically advantageous for him to do so. Anyway, many Democratic senators, including David Pryor of Arkansas, Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, and Carol Moseley Brown of Illinois, the only African American serving in the US Senate at that time, had already told President Clinton that Mrs. Guinier's interviews with senators were going poorly and had urged him to withdraw her nomination. Or I'm sorry, it was on June the 4th, 1993, not on June the 2nd. The US Congress at the time was considering Clinton's first budget and was only able eventually to approve it by the narrowest of margins in the Senate, provided by US Vice President Al Gore, and by a 2-vote margin in the US House of Representatives. Guinier, for her part, acknowledged that her writings were often unclear and subject to vastly different interpretations, but believed that the political attacks had distorted and caricatured her academic philosophies. According to William Coleman Jr., who had served as Transportation Secretary under President Gerald Ford, the withdrawal was a grave loss both to President Clinton and the country. The president's yanking of the nomination, caving into shrill, unsubstantiated attacks, was not only unfair, but some would say political cowardice. And then another way in which she through which she claimed, for example, the ethnic and racial minorities and women would be represented more fairly, was to give voters multiple votes, as many votes as there were legislators to be elected from these proposed or hypothetical multi-member electoral districts. Otherwise, she has been rather successful in her professional career, serving first as law professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School for 10 years, then joining Harvard Law School in 1998, and then lecturing regularly still until now at various other law schools and universities, including Yale, Stanford, New York University, University of Texas at Austin, Berkeley, University of California in Los Angeles, Rice, University of Chicago. In 2007, she was a visiting professor at Columbia Law School, and in 2009 she was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She has written over 24 law review articles as well as 5 books. The Tyranny of the Meritocracy, Democratizing Higher Education in a Democracy, The Miners' Cannery, Rethinking Race and Power, Lift Every Voice, Turning a Civil Rights Setback into a New Vision for Social Justice, Becoming Gentlemen, Women, Law Schools and Institutional Change, and at last, The Tyranny or the Tyranny of the Majority.